The doors of the Beaumont Grand Hotel ballroom were carved from imported mahogany, polished until they reflected the chandelier light like dark water. For nearly a century, those doors had opened for senators, oil heirs, Oscar winners, and old money dynasties whose names appeared on Manhattan buildings. But on the night of October 11th, when those doors swung open at 9:47 p.m., every conversation in the room died at the exact same second. Glasses froze halfway to lips. A violinist missed a note. A woman in a $30,000 Valentino gown actually whispered, "Oh my God," loud enough that the people 3 tables away heard her. And the man at the center of it all, Adrian Keller, billionaire, magazine cover, the so-called architect of the future, turned around with a champagne flute still in his hand, looked at the woman walking through those doors, and went completely, terribly white. Because the woman he had thrown away 1 year ago had just walked back into his life, and she had not come back to cry. She had come back to collect. But to understand why a single woman walking into a charity gala could silence the most powerful room in New York City, we have to go back. We have to go back to who Evelyn Keller used to be, who Adrian Keller pretended to be. And the night a marriage of 22 years ended over a glass of Pinot Noir in a penthouse overlooking Central Park. Before we go there, do me one small favor. If a story about a woman who got thrown away by the man she built sounds like something you want to hear all the way through, and trust me, you do, hit that subscribe button right now and tell me in the comments which city you're watching from. I want to know where in the world this story is being heard tonight. New York, São Paulo, London, Lagos, a tiny town no one has ever heard of. Drop it below. I read every single comment. Now, let's go back to the beginning. Adrian Keller was not born wealthy. That detail mattered, even though most of Manhattan had forgotten it. He grew up in a cracked 3-bedroom house in Bridgeport, Connecticut, the son of a high school math teacher and a hospital janitor. He was a brilliant, hungry, impossible boy who taught himself to code on a library computer and got himself into Stanford on a scholarship at 17. He met Evelyn Marsh in his sophomore year. She was a literature student from a working-class town in Ohio, sharp as a knife, with quiet eyes and a laugh she rarely gave away. He used to say in interviews, in toasts in front of investors, that Evelyn was the first person who ever made him believe in himself, that she paid his rent for 6 months after he dropped out of Stanford to start his first company, that she sold her grandmother's pearls to help him cover a payroll he couldn't make in 2009. That without Evelyn Keller, there would be no Adrian Keller. He used to say that, past tense. The company he built, Veritone Systems, an artificial intelligence platform that had quietly embedded itself into half the Fortune 500, had made him worth, on paper, around $4.2 billion by the time he was 46. Evelyn became, almost without noticing it, the wife of the billionaire, the wife at the table, the wife in the photograph behind him. She was 44 years old, still beautiful, still sharp, still kind in a way Manhattan was not used to. She ran 2 foundations. She read 3 newspapers a day. She remembered the names of every doorman, every driver, every waiter in every building they ever entered. She was, by the unanimous and quiet agreement of the staff at every restaurant they frequented, the more impressive of the 2 Kellers. But that was not how Adrian saw it anymore. The trouble had begun 2 years before that gala, though Evelyn would only realize it in retrospect, the way one realizes after a long illness that the first symptom appeared months before the diagnosis. Adrian began to come home later. Then, not at all. Then his phone, which had been an open book between them for 20 years, started living face down on tables. He stopped looking at her when she spoke. He started correcting her in front of other people, small corrections, the kind a man makes to test how much a woman will let him take from her in public. She let him take a little, then a little more. She was, after all, a woman of patience, raised by a mother who used to say that a marriage was a long road, and the worst potholes always came after the prettiest stretches. Isabella Vane entered the picture in March of the year that everything ended. She was 23 years old. She had walked for Versace at 15, been on the cover of Italian Vogue at 19, and had recently been hired as the new global face of a watch brand in which Veritone Systems had taken a controlling interest. Adrian met her at the campaign launch in Milan. Evelyn was not there. She had stayed home because her father in Ohio was dying of lung cancer, and she was driving back and forth between Manhattan and Cleveland every other weekend, holding his hand in a hospice room that smelled of antiseptic and old roses. What few people knew, and what almost no photographer had captured, was the version of Isabella Vane who existed when the cameras stopped clicking. The first time Adrian took her to dinner at Le Bernardin, she ordered the cheapest fish on the menu out of habit, and then, when he laughed at her, blushed and changed it. She had grown up in a 2-room apartment in Constanța, Romania, the older of 2 daughters of a seamstress and a man who had left when she was 9. She had been scouted at 13 in a shopping mall in Bucharest. She spoke 4 languages. She had not finished high school. She kept, in a small leather notebook in her purse, a list of English idioms she did not yet understand, written in small, careful handwriting, phrases like cutting corners, the elephant in the room, to have someone's number. Adrian had seen the notebook once, picked it up at the breakfast table, read 3 lines, and laughed. He had not laughed unkindly, but he had not stopped laughing for a long time. Isabella had taken the notebook back without a word, and put it in her bag and not taken it out again in his apartment. That same week, in Ohio, Evelyn's father died on a Tuesday in May. Adrian did not come to the funeral. He sent a text message that said, "Court in Tokyo, heart with you, A." She read that text standing in the rain outside a Methodist church in Ohio. She read it 3 times. She put the phone in her purse. She walked back inside, and she sat in the front pew, and she held her mother's hand, and she did not cry. She had learned, over 22 years of marriage, that there were certain wounds you did not let a man like Adrian see. When she came back to Manhattan, she found that her husband had moved Isabella Vane into a suite at the Lowell Hotel. She found out the way wives in her position always found out. Not from him, but from a friend who didn't want to tell her, but didn't want her to be the last to know. The friend was a woman named Margaret Aldrich, 68 years old, 3 husbands behind her, who took Evelyn for tea at the Carlisle and said, very gently with one diamond-laden hand over hers, "Darling, I love you, and I am sorry, but you need to hear this from someone who loves you." Evelyn did not cry at the Carlisle. She thanked Margaret. She finished her tea. She walked the 18 blocks back to the penthouse on 5th Avenue in 3-inch heels, in August heat, and when she got home she sat at the kitchen island for an hour without moving. Then she poured herself a glass of Pinot Noir and waited for her husband to come home. He came home at 11:14 p.m. He smelled of someone else's perfume. He was loosening his tie when he walked into the kitchen, and the first thing he said when he saw her sitting there with the wine was, "Why are you sitting in the dark?" She said, "Adrian, sit down." She told him she knew. She told him she knew about Isabella, about the Lowell, about the trip to Capri he had told her was a bored retreat. She told him, in a voice she barely recognized as her own, calm, almost gentle, that she was not going to scream, and she was not going to throw a glass, and she was not going to make a scene, because she had too much dignity for him to take that from her too, but that he needed to understand that what he was doing was going to cost him eventually more than he could imagine. He looked at her across the kitchen island for a long moment. And then Adrian Keller, the man who had spent 2 decades telling the world he owed her everything, did something that she would replay in her mind for the next 12 months. He smiled. He smiled and he said, "Evelyn, Let's be adults. I'm 46. I built an empire. I'm not going to spend the next 40 years sitting across from a woman who reads poetry and runs charity boards. I want a life. I want to be seen. Isabella she's the future. You are, and I mean this with love. You're the past. We had a beautiful past. I will take care of you. You will not want for anything. But this marriage is over. I should have ended it a year ago. I'm ending it now. She didn't speak. He kept going. He always kept going, because he had never in 22 years learned that the worst thing you could do to Evelyn Marsh was keep talking when she had gone quiet. I want you to move out of the penthouse by the end of the month. I'll have Daniel handle the paperwork. There's a prenup. You know there's a prenup. I'll be generous, more than the prenup says. But I need this to be clean. I have a launch in February. I cannot have a war. Do you understand me? She looked at him for a long time, and then she said in the same calm voice, Adrian, do you remember what I sold to keep your company alive in 2009? He blinked. What? Do you remember what I sold? He frowned. Your pearls. Your grandmother's pearls. Evelyn, why are we... You're going to wish, she said softly, that you had remembered who I was, before you decided who I wasn't. She finished her wine. She got up. She went to bed in the guest room. What she did not show Adrian, because she had spent 22 years not showing him, was what happened in that guest room. She closed the door. She locked it. She sat on the edge of the bed for exactly 4 seconds. And then Evelyn Marsh, 44 years old, daughter of a steelworker, graduate of Stanford, founder of 2 foundations, picked up the porcelain lamp on the nightstand, a lamp Adrian had bought her for their 15th anniversary, a lamp she had once loved, and she threw it against the wall as hard as she could. It exploded. The shade rolled across the carpet. She picked up a framed photograph of the 2 of them in Positano, taken 7 years earlier, and she threw that too. The glass cracked across his face. She picked up the small ceramic bowl where she kept her earrings, and she was about to throw it when she stopped, because her hand was shaking so badly that she could not grip it properly. She sat back down on the bed, and then, because nobody could hear her, she screamed once into a pillow for almost a full minute. It was an animal sound. It came from a place she did not know she still had. When it was over, she was hoarse and her face was wet, and she felt for one strange moment more alive than she had felt in a decade. She wiped her face. She got up. She picked up the lamp pieces and the broken glass and the shade, and she put them in the wastebasket, and she made the bed. She washed her face in the bathroom. She did not look at herself in the mirror. In the morning she was gone. She did not fight the divorce. She did not give a single interview. She did not call a single columnist. She accepted the prenup settlement, $18 million, a number that Adrian's lawyer Daniel privately called generous, and that Adrian privately called cheap. She moved out of the Fifth Avenue penthouse on the last day of August. She told her 2 foundations she was stepping back for a year. She told her closest friends she was traveling. And then simply, Evelyn Keller disappeared. For the first 3 months, the New York gossip pages tried to find her. They couldn't. Page 6 ran a column titled, "Where in the World is Evelyn Keller?" with rumors placing her in Bali, in Tuscany, at a wellness retreat in Sedona, in a Buddhist monastery in Bhutan. None of it was true. The truth was simpler and stranger. The truth was that she had gone to a small house on the coast of Maine, a house her father had left her, a house Adrian had never visited, a house that smelled of cedar and the sea, and she had sat there for the first 3 weeks, and she had cried. She cried the way she had not let herself cry in Ohio. She cried the way she had not let herself cry in the kitchen. She cried until something inside her, an old and exhausted thing, broke open. The worst night came in the 7th week. It was a Friday in October. The wind was loud off the Atlantic. She had been doing well for 9 days. She had been running on the beach. She had been reading. She had been sleeping through the night. And then That Friday she had gone into town for groceries, and she had walked past a newsstand, and on the cover of a magazine, a glossy, stupid magazine, the kind she used to laugh at, was Adrian and Isabella, in Capri, on a boat, her bare back, his hand on her bare back, her mouth open in a laugh, his face turned slightly toward the camera as if he had known the photographer was there. The headline said, "America's most powerful new couple." She walked out of the store with the groceries. She drove the 11 miles back to the Cedar House. She put the groceries away, and then she opened a bottle of red wine, and she drank it. The whole bottle. By 11 p.m. She had her phone in her hand and Adrian's number on the screen, and she had typed and deleted 7 different messages, each one more humiliating than the last. "Are you happy? Do you remember Positano? I sold my grandmother's pearls. I hope she destroys you. I hope you wake up at 60 and you are alone." Her thumb hovered over the send button on the last one for almost a full minute. Then she put the phone face down on the kitchen counter. She walked outside. She stood barefoot on the cold porch in the October wind, and she looked at the black Atlantic, and she said, out loud, to no one, "Not him, not tonight." She walked back inside. She poured the rest of the wine down the sink. She drank a glass of water. She went to bed. She did not text him, and in the morning on a cold Saturday in October, she stopped crying. She made a cup of black coffee. She sat at the kitchen table, and she made a list. The list was not a list of revenge. That is important. The list, in Evelyn Marsh's careful, slanted handwriting, was a list of every single thing she had let go of for 22 years. Her writing, her own investments. She had been an excellent investor in college, with a head for numbers Adrian had always quietly resented. Her friendships outside the orbit of Adrian's career, her body, her voice, her independence. The list was 4 pages long, and at the bottom of the 4th page, she wrote a single sentence. "I am not going to spend the next year hating him. I am going to spend the next year becoming myself again." What happens after that is what happens after that. If this part of the story is hitting something in you, if you've ever been in a moment like that, standing on a porch in the wind, deciding not to send the text, drop a heart in the comments and tell me one word that describes what you've had to rebuild in your own life. One word. I want to see them stacking up. And while you're there, hit the like button so this story reaches someone tonight who needs to hear it. Now let's get to the part where Evelyn becomes someone new. The year that followed was not glamorous. It was not a montage. There were no spa weekends, no European lovers, no makeover scenes with friends drinking champagne. What there was work. In November, Evelyn called an old friend from Stanford named Priya Shah, a woman who had become, in the intervening 20 years, one of the most respected venture capitalists on the West Coast. Priya flew to Maine. The 2 women sat on the porch of the Cedar House with mugs of tea and watched the grey Atlantic, and Evelyn told her very simply what she wanted. She wanted to invest. Quietly, strategically. She had $18 million and 22 years of having sat in rooms where men like Adrian Keller had talked about deals as if she were furniture. She had absorbed more than any of them had ever realized. By January, she had quietly acquired a 4% stake in a small AI ethics firm in Boston called Aula Labs, a company that, as it happened, was the principal whistleblower in an ongoing federal inquiry into deceptive data practices at 3 large tech firms, one of which was Veritone Systems. She did not put her name on the acquisition. She used a holding company called Pearl Holdings, a private joke named after her grandmother's necklace. By February, she had reconnected with 2 old friends from her early years in New York, a documentary filmmaker named Catalina Reyes and a former Wall Street Journal investigative reporter named Henry Voss, who had been fired 3 years earlier under suspicious circumstances. Henry, it turned out, had been let go after he had begun investigating an unnamed billionaire tech CEO for what he believed was a pattern of using shell companies to pressure smaller competitors into selling under value. Henry had never been able to prove it. He had not been able to prove it because every door, every source, every record had been closed to him. Evelyn opened those doors. She did not open them with rage. She opened them with patience. She remembered names from 20 years of dinner parties, wives whose husbands had worked with Adrian, assistants who had been fired without explanation, 2 former Veritone executives who had signed NDAs, and who, when Evelyn called them personally, said the same sentence in different words. "I always liked you, Evelyn. I always thought he didn't deserve you." By spring, Henry Voss had a story, a real one, sourced, documented, devastating. By summer, Catalina Reyes was quietly filming a documentary about the human cost of unchecked AI deployment in hiring software, a documentary in which Veritone Systems, though never named in the trailer, was the unmistakable central villain. While all of this was happening, 600 miles south, in a penthouse Adrian had bought her on Central Park West, Isabella Vane was beginning to understand something she did not yet have the English for. She understood it for the first time on a Thursday night in March at a dinner at the Pierre Hotel, when a producer she had met twice in her life put a hand on the small of her bare back and left it there for a full 30 seconds, while Adrian stood 3 feet away, laughing at a joke. Isabella looked at Adrian. Adrian looked at her. Adrian smiled, a small, almost imperceptible smile, and turned back to his conversation. The producer's hand stayed where it was. The message was clear enough that even her notebook would not have needed it written down. She understood it again on a Sunday morning in May, when she came down to the kitchen in a robe, and Adrian was on the phone with someone, and she heard him say, in a voice he did not know carried, "No, she's beautiful. She's perfect for what I need. She's not, God no, she's not Evelyn. That's the point." He saw her in the doorway. He smiled. He waved her over. He did not lower his voice. He did not stop talking. She went back upstairs. She sat on the edge of the bathtub for 40 minutes. She did not cry because she had not cried since she was 16, but she sat there for 40 minutes with her arms wrapped around herself in a way she had not done since the apartment in Constanza. And she understood it for the last time on a Tuesday in August, when she was photographed leaving a restaurant in Soho, and the photograph that ran the next morning was captioned in the Daily Mail, "Billionaire's arm candy gets upgrade. Isabella Vane steps out in new dress." Not her name. Arm candy, that was the headline. She read it on her phone in the back of the car. She read it twice. She put the phone down. She looked out the window at Manhattan sliding by. And she thought in Romanian, because the thought was too large for her English, "I am a thing this man owns." She did not leave him that day. She did not have anywhere to go. Back in Maine, by August, Evelyn had also done something else. Something smaller and stranger, and in the end more important than any of it. She had started writing again. She had filled 3 notebooks in the Cedar House. She had taken long walks. She had lost 12 pounds, not because she wanted to, but because grief had finally been replaced by something with appetite for the world. She had cut her dark hair shorter in a way that made her cheekbones, which had always been remarkable, suddenly impossible to ignore. She had started running on the beach in the mornings. She looked, when Priya flew back out to see her in September, like a woman who had remembered something the world had been trying to make her forget. Priya, sitting on the same porch where they had sat 10 months earlier, said quietly, "Evelyn, you know there's a gala at the Beaumont in October." Evelyn smiled, looking at the water. "I know," she said. "Adrian's announcing the IPO," Priya said. "The whole city's going to be there. Are you sure you want to go?" Evelyn took a sip of her tea. "I'm sure," she said. He doesn't know you're coming." "No," Evelyn said. "He doesn't. Do you want him to?" Evelyn was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "Priya, I spent 22 years making sure he was never surprised by anything. I owe him one surprise. Just one. If you've made it this far, I need you to do me one favor, and I mean it. The next part of this story is the part you came here for. The doors, the ballroom, the walk across the floor. Before we step into the Beaumont, share this video with one person. One. A friend, a sister, a co-worker, someone you know has been underestimated by a man who thought she would stay quiet. Send it to them tonight. That's all I'm asking. Now let's walk into that ballroom. The Beaumont Grand Hotel sits on Park Avenue between 50th and 51st Street. It was built in 1929, 3 weeks before the stock market crashed, and it has survived every disaster the 20th century could throw at it. Its ballroom, the Astor Room, has hosted 6 presidents, 4 royal weddings, and one of the most legendary New Year's parties in the city's history. On the night of October 11th, it had been booked for the Keller Foundation's annual Children's Literacy Gala, a gala which, this year, was doubling as the unofficial launch event for Veritone Systems' upcoming IPO. The temperature in Manhattan that night was 41 degrees. A cold front had come in off the Hudson that afternoon, and by sunset the sidewalks were slick with the thin first rain of autumn. Town cars idled in a double line down Park Avenue, their wipers moving in slow arcs. Doormen held umbrellas over the heads of women in floor-length gowns. Photographers stood penned behind a velvet rope, calling out names, and the names came: Senator Whitfield, the Hellman family, the Bashirs, 2 New York Times publishers, a Pulitzer-winning novelist, 3 NBA owners, the new mayor, an Oscar nominee, the entire board of MoMA. Inside, the Astor Room had been transformed into something out of a Fitzgerald novel. 800 white roses suspended from a ceiling rigged with constellations of warm Edison bulbs, a string quartet playing soft, unobtrusive Debussy, waiters in white gloves moving through the crowd with trays of champagne and small dishes of caviar on toasted brioche. Adrian Keller arrived at 8:45 p.m. He wore a charcoal tuxedo, custom-tailored in Milan, with a pocket square the exact pale grey of Isabella Vane's eyes. Isabella, on his arm, wore a backless emerald gown that the next day's Vogue online would call the most photographed dress of the year. She was 24 years old now. She was breathtaking. She had been coached in the previous week by Adrian's personal publicist on how to greet certain women, how to laugh at certain jokes, how to deflect questions about her age, her past, and her foundation work. Of which, in fairness to her, she did have some, though most of it had been arranged in the previous 6 months. What no one in that ballroom could see, behind the smile she had been trained to wear, was that Isabella Vane had not eaten in 2 days, and that under the emerald gown she was wearing a small silver cross her mother had given her at 13. A cross she had stopped wearing in public 3 years ago, and had put back on that morning without explaining to herself why. The crowd swirled around them. Adrian moved through it with the easy confidence of a man who had won, because he had won. The IPO was projected at $38 billion. He was about to become one of the 20 richest men in America. The woman on his arm was on the cover of 2 magazines that week. His ex-wife had vanished, neatly, without scandal. Everything was, as he liked to say in his earnings calls, on plan. At 9:31 p.m., he stepped up to the podium and gave a 6-minute speech about the importance of literacy. He spoke movingly about growing up the son of 2 working people in Bridgeport. He spoke about books. He did not, anyone noticed, mention his ex-wife by name, though Evelyn Keller had founded the literacy foundation in question with her own money in 2014 and had run it personally until last August. At 9:38 p.m., he sat back down. Isabella squeezed his hand under the table. He raised his champagne flute to a billionaire from Dallas at the next table at 9:46 p.m. At a man in a charcoal suit, a man no one in the room recognized but who would, the next morning, be identified by the New York Post as a former federal prosecutor named Marcus Hale, slipped quietly into the room and took a seat at table 11, near the back. At 9:47 p.m., the mahogany doors of the Astor Room opened. What happened in the next 90 seconds would be described in the years to come by everyone who was there, with the unreliable certainty of people who had witnessed something they did not entirely believe. Some would say a hush fell over the room. Some would say the music kept playing, but no one could hear it. Some would say they remembered very specifically the sound of a single fork hitting a porcelain plate. Evelyn Keller stood in the doorway. She wore a column gown of deep oxblood red, cut simply, with a single shoulder. Her dark hair was shorter than it had been a year ago, swept to one side. She wore no necklace. She wore no rings. She carried no clutch. She walked into the Astor Room the way a woman walks into a room she owns, and the room, because rooms always know, adjusted itself around her. Adrian saw her at the moment she crossed the threshold. The champagne flute in his hand did not fall, but it tilted, and a thin line of liquid spilled onto the white tablecloth, and Isabella, sitting beside him, turned her head slowly to see what he was looking at. Evelyn did not look at Adrian. Not yet. She looked first at Margaret Aldrich, at the table to the left of the dance floor, and Margaret, 68 years old, 3 husbands behind her, stood up, just stood up, without a word, and she began with 2 heavily ringed hands to clap. It was the strangest sound in that ballroom that night, a single woman clapping in a room of 800, and then the woman at the next table, a publisher, 60 years old, who had been a friend of Evelyn's foundation for a decade, stood up too, and clapped. By the time Evelyn had walked 20 feet into the Astor Room, 14 women had stood up. By the time she reached the center of the dance floor, the number was 30. The men, on the whole, did not stand. The men were watching Adrian. Adrian had gone the color of paper. Evelyn stopped in the center of the dance floor. She turned slowly, and she looked for the first time at the man who had been her husband for 22 years. She smiled. It was not a cruel smile. That was perhaps the most frightening thing about it. It was a small, almost sad, almost affectionate smile. The smile of a woman who, against everything she had hoped for, had been proven right about a man she had once loved. "Adrian," she said, her voice carried. "Astor Rooms have been acoustically engineered since 1929 to carry the voice of a single person across them. I hope I'm not interrupting." The next thing that happened was that Henry Voss, sitting at table 9 in a dinner jacket he had borrowed from his brother-in-law, slid an envelope across his table to a man from the New York Times. The next thing that happened was that Catalina Reyes, sitting at table 14, lifted a small black object from her clutch, not a phone, an actual press recorder, the kind documentarians use, and pressed a single button. The next thing that happened was that Marcus Hale, the former federal prosecutor at table 11, took out a folded document and laid it, very calmly, on the table in front of him. None of this would have mattered on its own. What mattered was that Adrian Keller, looking at his ex-wife across a dance floor in front of 800 of the most powerful people in New York City, did the only thing a man like Adrian Keller knew how to do when cornered. He smiled. He stood up. He walked toward her, hand extended, and he said in the warmest voice he could manage, "Evelyn, my God, it's so good to see you. Please, please join us." She looked at his hand. She did not take it. "Adrian," she said gently, "I'm not joining you. I'm announcing something." The Astor Room, 800 people, held its breath. "Evelyn," he began. "You're going to want to sit down for this," she said. He did not sit down. She turned slightly, so that her voice carried not just to him but to the room. She had practiced this for 3 weeks, not the words. The words had been written for her by no one, the way of standing, the way of breathing, the way of letting her voice be small and the room be big, and watch the room lean in. "Most of you know me," she said. "Some of you have not seen me in a year. I want to thank you first for the kindness many of you showed me in the weeks after my marriage ended. I will never forget it. I particularly want to thank Margaret Aldrich, who told me a truth I needed to hear, and Priya Shah, who reminded me that I had a brain." Soft laughter, the laughter of a room that did not yet know what was coming. "I want to make 3 quick announcements tonight," she said, "if you'll indulge me. The first is that, as of this morning, the Keller Foundation for Children's Literacy, which I founded in 2014 and which has been operating under my husband's name for the past year, has been formally restructured. It is now the Marsh Foundation for Children's Literacy. The board approved the change unanimously yesterday afternoon. My ex-husband was not on the call. Adrian, I wanted to tell you in person, I'm sorry to do it this way." Adrian's mouth opened slightly. He did not speak. "Second," Evelyn said, "I want to introduce you to a few people you may not know. Henry Voss from Table 9. Henry, please wave." Henry, looking embarrassed, raised a hand. Henry is a journalist. Many of you may remember him from the Wall Street Journal. He is, as of this evening, the chief investigative correspondent for a publication being launched next month called The Lantern. His first story, a story he has been working on for 4 years, with my support for the last 7 months, will be published on Monday morning. It concerns a pattern of shell company acquisitions and coerced settlements at a certain Manhattan-based artificial intelligence firm. Some of you may already have received summaries through your legal teams. If you have not, I would suggest checking your inboxes by Sunday evening. The silence in the Astor room had taken on a new texture. "Third," Evelyn said, and now her voice was even softer, even more carefully placed, "I want to thank a gentleman at table 11, Mr. Marcus Hale. Marcus, you don't need to wave. Marcus is a former federal prosecutor with the Southern District. He's representing me and approximately 14 other former employees and counterparties of Veritone Systems in a civil suit that was filed at 4 o'clock this afternoon. The suit is unsealed. It is, as of approximately 20 minutes ago, public record. I'm sure tomorrow's papers will give it the attention it deserves." She paused. She looked at Adrian. "Adrian," she said quietly, "you told me in our kitchen a little over a year ago that I was the past. You were partially correct. I was, for 22 years, your past. I helped build the company you are about to take public on Tuesday. I covered your payroll in 2009 with my grandmother's pearls. I have not asked in 22 years for credit for any of it. I am not asking for it tonight either. I am only here to make sure that going forward, you cannot continue to be a version of yourself that requires me to be invisible." She paused again. "That's all," she said. "I'm not going to ruin everyone's evening. The Marsh Foundation will be hosting its own gala on November 20th. Many of you have already been invited. I hope to see you there. Adrian, I'd say I wish you well, but I think we both know what's coming, and I don't believe in lying anymore. Enjoy your night." She turned. She walked slowly back across the dance floor. The room did not move. And then, and this was the part that, for years afterward, people would describe with the most disbelief, Isabella Vane stood up. Isabella stood up at her table. She looked at Adrian, who was still standing, frozen, the color of paper. She looked at Evelyn, walking away. And then she did something that absolutely no one in that ballroom, including Adrian, would have predicted. She picked up her own clutch. She stepped away from her chair, and she followed Evelyn Keller across the dance floor, 3 steps behind, in an emerald gown, 24 years old, and out through the mahogany doors of the Astor room. Her hand, as she walked, went briefly to her chest, to the small silver cross under the emerald gown that nobody else in that room could see. She caught up with Evelyn in the hallway outside. The hallway was empty, except for 2 waiters and a coat-check girl, all of whom were pretending very badly not to listen. "Mrs. Keller," Isabella said. Evelyn stopped. She turned. The 2 women looked at each other for a long moment. Isabella, 6 inches taller in her heels. Evelyn, perfectly still. "I didn't know," Isabella said, "about any of that. The companies, the shell things. I want you to know I didn't know." "I believe you," Evelyn said. "He told me you were—" "I'm sure he did." Isabella looked down. She was for a moment just a 24-year-old girl in a dress she had not paid for. "My mother used to read your foundation's books to my sister," she said, "in Romania, when we came over. I should have looked you up. I should have— I'm sorry." Evelyn looked at her for a long, careful moment. "Isabella," she said gently, "you don't owe me an apology. You owe yourself a better year than the one you just had. Take care of yourself." She put a hand, very briefly, on Isabella's bare shoulder. Then she walked away, down the marble hallway, toward the lobby of the Beaumont Grand Hotel, where a town car was waiting for her in the cold October rain. Behind her, in the Astor room, the night had not yet ended. Adrian Keller would, over the next 40 minutes, attempt to recover. He would attempt to laugh it off. He would attempt to call her unstable. He would attempt to tell 2 of the Times reporters in the room, off the record, that she had been going through something. 2 of the Times reporters in the room would, the next morning, print every word of it on the record. The IPO, scheduled for the following Tuesday, would be delayed. Then delayed again. Then quietly pulled. Henry Voss's story, when it ran on Monday morning, would be 12,000 words long. It would be the most read piece of journalism in the United States that week. It would be cited in 3 Senate hearings before the end of the year. Catalina Reyes's documentary, which would premiere at Sundance 14 months later, would win the Audience Award. The civil suit, filed at 4 o'clock that Friday afternoon, would settle 2 years later for an amount that was never publicly disclosed, but which industry analysts estimated at somewhere between $400 and $600 million. Adrian Keller would, by the spring of the following year, no longer be the CEO of Veritone Systems. He would still be wealthy. He would not, however, be invited to a gala at the Beaumont Grand Hotel again. Isabella Vane would break up with him publicly 2 weeks after the gala in a single sentence on her own Instagram. She would, 3 months later, enroll at NYU to finish the bachelor's degree she had left unfinished at 19. She would, in her first semester, take a literature course taught by a guest lecturer named Evelyn Marsh. Neither woman would ever speak publicly about that course. And Evelyn Marsh, she had taken her own name back the morning after the gala in a quiet appointment at a courthouse downtown, would, 6 months later, publish a book of essays. It would not be about Adrian. It would, in fact, not name him once. It would be about the cedar house in Maine, and her father and her mother and the broken porcelain lamp in the guest room, and what it means to lose yourself slowly enough that you don't notice, and what it costs to find yourself again. The book would be called Pearl. It would spend 19 weeks on the New York Times bestseller list. On the night of the gala, after she had spoken to Isabella in the hallway, Evelyn Marsh got into a black town car on Park Avenue. The rain had thickened. The driver, a man named Eduardo, who had been her family's driver for 9 years before she let him go in August of the previous year, and whom she had rehired 3 weeks ago at twice his old salary, looked at her in the rearview mirror. "Home, Mrs. Marsh." She looked out the window at the lights of Manhattan, sliding past in long ribbons of gold and red. "Eduardo," she said softly, "take the long way." He nodded. He pulled away from the curb. The Beaumont Grand Hotel slipped away behind them. The Astor room, with all its chandeliers and all its roses and all its 800 witnesses, slipped away behind them. Park Avenue opened up ahead, glittering, indifferent, alive. Evelyn Marsh, 45 years old, leaned her head against the cool glass of the window. She closed her eyes, and for the first time in 14 months, for the first time perhaps in 22 years, she felt the small, quiet, impossible thing that her grandmother had once told her was the only thing in life worth waiting for. She felt exactly like herself. The city kept moving around her. She had come home. Now, before you close this video, one last thing. I need you to do something for me. In the comments below, tell me the exact moment in this story that hit you the hardest. Was it the funeral text, the porcelain lamp against the wall, the bottle of wine on the porch, and not sending the message? Was it Isabella's silver cross under the emerald dress, or was it the walk across the dance floor with Margaret Aldrich standing up to clap? Tell me. Because the comment that moves me the most, I'm going to use as the inspiration for the next story I tell on this channel. So make it count. Hit subscribe if you're new here, give this video a like if Evelyn earned it, and I'll see you in the next one.